All right, welcome everybody to the first Flameside Chat. My name is Jamie Powell, and I work here at Center College. I actually work in the library. I'm the evening circulation supervisor, but I'm taking a little break from my usual gig tonight to host a conversation with one of our own, Dr. Bo Weston. He is the John M. and Louise Van Winkle Professor of Sociology and the chair of the Anthropology Sociology program here at Center. In 2011, Bo was awarded a National Endowment for the Humanities grant to develop a course called The Happy Society. And tonight, Bo is going to talk about how you can be a happy person and contribute to that happy society. Now, this is going to be a conversation. Bo is going to talk for a few minutes, Q&A. So get those questions ready and post your comments on YouTube. Tweet your questions. If you're on Twitter, you can tweet your questions to #Flameside. And right now, let's get started and turn it over to Bo.
Very good. Thank you, Jamie. I have set myself an alarm that will go off in about 15 minutes. You will hear a duck quack, at which point I will stop talking and we'll look forward to your questions. So this is a 13-week course that I'm going to compress into 15 minutes. So I'm leaving some stuff out that I hope you'll bring out in the Q&A. Aristotle says that happiness is the end of life. It's the aim and purpose of human existence. And it's the one end that is not a means to another end. So it's really the final end. In the book, The Nicomachean Ethics, he develops what he means by happiness and says that it's an action of the soul in accordance with virtue. And what's important about that is it's an action, not an emotion. And it is virtuous in a way that ultimately is mysterious, but we work this out in practice. We work it out by doing it. We learn how to be virtuous by doing the actions that come to us in our daily life. At the end of the Nicomachean Ethics, he says the greatest happiness is contemplation. And I read that as a contemplation of a life of virtuous action. So one of the things we're going to talk about today is how to get from individual happiness to the happy society, which I, as a sociologist, am very interested in. So our hop, skip, and a jump will be Aristotle, positive psychology, and Tocqueville. And we'll throw in some other stuff along the way. Philosophers like to debate the meanings of words. I think the debate about the meaning of happiness is interminable. And so about a generation ago, a bunch of psychologists cut the Gordian knot and said, okay, we're not going to define what happiness is. We're just going to go ask people. So they started asking people the question, on the whole, would you say that you are very happy, somewhat happy or pretty happy, or not too happy? And we find a bunch of interesting things. One, almost everyone can answer that question. Two, the results hold up. They're fairly steady from society to society. They change, go up and down a little bit, but basically the proportions hold. And three, they're correlated with a lot of other interesting things, which is what the sociology and psychology of happiness have been working on. In the United States, in general, about a third, 30 to 35% of Americans at any given time will say they are very happy. And a big half, 50 to 55%, will say that they are somewhat happy or pretty happy. Two different surveys use different wording for that question. And then it's 10 to 15% will say that they're not too happy. And not surprisingly, that last category, the not too happy, is pretty volatile because, understandably, people don't want to stay there. They try to get happy. If you ask those same people 5 years later, many of them have moved out of the not too happy category into at least the somewhat happy. Then we look then at what that happiness correlates with. We find that the first two things that we often ask in social science is how does it relate to money and how does it relate to health? And the economists have spent a lot of time on the relationship between money and happiness and came up with what to them seems like a paradox. Most normal people, I don't think it's paradoxical, but this is the way they read it. The Easterlin paradox, named after the economist who named this, found that in general, from zero to median income, more money is more happy. There's a linear relationship between money and happiness. But from the median of whatever's the median in your society, more money roughly correlates with more happiness. The richest people are happier than the middle income people, but not a lot, not a linear relation. That once you're economically secure, have enough, then the other things that make for happiness matter more. And I'll come to what those are in a minute. The analogy with health is interesting too, that if you're basically healthy, the relationship between health and happiness also is well correlated. If you're sick, then that tends to make you unhappy. If you're chronically ill, that tends to make you unhappy. But wealth and money, once you have enough, we don't think about it as much. And so we can concentrate on the other things. And the core of the other things is the quality of relationships we have with those closest to us. And so if you have a happy home life, you're likely to be happy, really, regardless of whatever else is going on in your life. And this then extends to other relationships. So if you have a happy home life and a happy work life, and you get along with your neighbors, then you're likely to be happy, regardless of how wealthy you are or what else is going on in the world, or the other things that you might worry about over there affecting other people. Now, I don't want to lose statistic, which is most people are very happy or somewhat happy, overwhelming majorities. Because if you ask how the world is going, many people say it's getting worse. Now, really, if you put those two things together, they can't both be true, right? If most people are happy and stay that way year after year, the world is not getting worse. So a lot of what happens when we think about happiness is we think about our own happiness as a state, and then we look at the world and imagine circumstances happening to other people that would make them unhappy and might make our whole world worse. Which is why when we go from the happiness of me to the happiness of society, we're a lot more optimistic about our own happiness than we are about making society a better place. But I want to be encouraging about making society a better place, and we'll work our way to that. So, if you have basic economic security, basic health, and relationships that are good, you have laid the foundation. That's really a wonderful thing. Let me say something about happiness in family life. Generally, people who are happily married are happy for the other things. Marriage tends to set the weather for the lives of people who are married in beating almost everything else. An interesting subset is that kids don't make you happy immediately. That having children tends to reduce the marital happiness of married couples. That they have a high happiness at the honeymoon. It goes down with each kid. It goes down to the trough when the kids are adolescents. It comes back up again as the kids get older, and then there's a second honeymoon when the nest is empty. That's a general pattern that you see commonly. But I think in a larger sense, when we go back to Aristotle, doing meaningful work is a thing that ultimately makes us happy, particularly when we contemplate it afterwards. And the work parents make in children is a thing that almost all parents find to be meaningful. Indeed, Arthur Brooks, one of the writers on Happiness in America, says that he thinks the reason that we find raising children so meaningful is because we have to sacrifice some marital happiness, something we value very much, in order to do it well. But that's not the end of the social relations of happiness. They don't just end with your family. We like to work. Human beings like to work and are made unhappy by not having work. Chronic unemployment is one of the reliable circumstances that makes people unhappy. And having what we think is meaningful, that serves some larger purpose, is one of the surest ways of thinking that your life is worthwhile and that is meaningful and that makes us happy. This is right in line with Aristotle. If you can work with other people, have good relationships with them, and do work that is meaningful, then you've pretty much hit the trifecta of what's likely to make your life and its impact on the world seem meaningful and happiness-making to you. The larger relations of society also correlate with happiness. So when we look at the Easterlin paradox at the individual level, more money is more happy up to the median, and then they're lightly correlated beyond that. This is also true at the national level. So if you line up all countries in the world from income, from the poorest to the richest, from poor to median, from the one the UN uses is from Afghanistan to Turkey. There's a linear relationship between money and happiness. But from Turkey to, say, Norway, the relationship breaks down. Some of those countries are happier, some of them less happy. And the things that correlate with happier countries are democracy, honest government, that is to say corruption tends to reduce happiness, and the quality of relationships in the middle level. in the community level, in the family relationships, and of course in work. Which brings us to Tocqueville. Alexis de Tocqueville wrote a wonderful, important book about America called Democracy in America in the 1830s. And it is still, for my money, the best analysis of American culture. He was an aristocrat from France, a country that was fitfully trying democracy. It went back and forth several times. And he was trying to find the essence of how America made democracy work in a way that could be educational for other countries trying to become democratic. And his conclusion was that Americans believed in self-interest, but self-interest rightly understood. And the right understanding is, when I work to make my community better, that makes my life better in turn. So when he looked at Americans, particularly on the frontier, and he came out to Kentucky, and as it was then the frontier and this area, he found that Americans faced with a problem take it upon themselves to address it. He said in the famous passage that in France, where they'd look to the government, or in England, where they'd look to a great man to organize a solution to a problem, in America, they form a committee. And this, he thought, was part of the genius of how American democracy worked, that we create voluntary associations to do a work, solve a social problem. We sacrifice some of our own liberty and time and money and so on to do that, but we gain back the solution to the problem, the pleasure of working together with other people on a meaningful task, and a better society. There's an interesting study about the effect of giving on the givers and on the community of givers. So if when we look at money given charitably in different communities, a 10% rise in giving leads to an 8% rise in happiness of the givers, but also a 6% rise in the happiness of non-givers living in the same community. That living in a community where other people are doing good things makes us happy, makes us more trusting and less fearful about society. And also, in the longer run, tends to make us more likely to give and contribute and be part of meaningful actions ourselves. One of the institutions most important in organizing people to work together to build up their communities are religious institutions. Robert Putnam, a political scientist at Harvard, wrote a famous book a few years ago called Bowling Alone. And this was applied Tocqueville. He was looking at what happened to the voluntary associations. And he said, we still do a lot of bowling, but we don't do it in leagues anymore. And so that book was the grim news of the decline of organizations that did community upbuilding. But then he and his student David Campbell wrote a second book called American Grace, in which they asked the question, well, what does hold us together? And their answer was religious institutions. That in general, it's not belief, it's doing. It's belonging to an organization, working together with people, tends to make people happier. And communities in which there are many people in religious organizations working together to upbuild the community makes the community better, makes it happier, more trusting, more likely to join in and do good works together. When you add up this set, you get a picture of the things that make for a happy community. You have people who have economic security, who have good relations in their families, with their spouses and their children, with their neighbors, with their coworkers. They're engaged in work that they think is meaningful, not only paid work, but also especially voluntary associations, as might be organized through religious organizations, for building up the community. And then in the larger picture, if they can do that in democratic societies, in which there is honest government and some kind of rougher equality. Gross inequality tends to reduce social trust. That's the formula, that's at least the correlates of a happier society. One of the things that I find in talking about happy societies is, I used to say just sort of matter-of-factly, the world is getting better. The world is getting better because we do this sort of thing. And that's met with incredulity. So I have to have another whole talk called The World is Getting Better, where I go through charts and charts, pages and pages, pictures and pictures of the many, many things that are getting better. Which leads to people say, well, how come I don't think it's getting better? How come it seems to be getting worse? How come we hear about wars and violence and disease and Ebola and ISIS and whatever it is? And there are several reasons that we're less likely to believe in the good news than is really warranted. One we are, the evolutionary psychologists think that we're more attuned to threat than to blessing. And that would make sense, that things that could kill us we're more attuned to notice and put on the horizon, and things that are good we just sort of take for granted. They become part of our regular, ordinary life, and we head back to that level of taking those things for granted. Another is that the news brings us bad news. But the news is not proportionate to reality, right? The news is a freak show. It's designed to bring you news of the unusual. That's what makes it news. And so if they can't find an unusually violent thing happening in our community, they'll go look in another one, and they'll keep looking until they find one. That's how they fill up news time. Moreover, some people, my mom used to say this, is don't say things are getting better, you'll jinx it, right? Sheer magical eye, evil eye thinking that we shouldn't mention those things. Another reason is in academic communities especially, since the Enlightenment, we've come to think that being intellectual means criticizing things. And particularly in the social studies, that being an intellectual means finding the hidden structure of oppression or exploitation or ungoodness underneath the apparent goodness of the world. And that becomes not just a thing that we seek, we look for those bad things, we don't want to be naive, but also it becomes a definition of being an intellectual. And that to say things are getting better is by definition to be naive. I say, as professor of sociology, none of those things are necessarily true. Right? None of those things are obligatory to believe. And when you look at the facts about the proportions of good things happening in the world, which is what sociology is particularly good for, giving us a sense of proportion, there's many, many things that are getting better. Most things in the world are getting better. This may lead to some questions. I'll just put that on the table there. So how does this relate back to happiness? The action of joining voluntary associations, of making happy families, of trying to solve problems together, of increasing trust and reducing fear works. It does actually make our society better. It is a way that your personal happiness can be connected with social happiness. And there, my friends, is the duck. I'm ready for your questions.
Okay, thanks, Bo, and thanks, duck friend. So we're going to take some questions now, so please post those on the YouTube stream or tweet them to us at #Flameside. And right now I've got one question, and I'm just going to post it up for you, Bo, and so you can take a look at it. I think you touched on a little bit since this was asked, but there's a part of it that you might want to address. Are you seeing that?
Yes.
Okay.
So I talked about the correlation between happiness and money and happiness and health, or the correlation between happiness and educational attainment. Very good. And religion. Education is happy making in general. It's happy making in part because it reduces fear. Right? It gives you a larger picture of how the world works. And most especially, it gives you some sense of proportion that the bad things that you know about now are like bad things that have happened before, which we have overcome, right? That these are not signs of the end time. This sort of thing has happened all the time. And moreover, because money is correlated with happiness, education is correlated with money, the population level, educated populations tend to be richer and more secure and healthier and more likely to be involved in doing things in society. That also contributes to their happiness. So there's an indirect relationship between education and happiness. Religion I partially mentioned. It is interesting that its belief is not well correlated with happiness, with one exception. If the core of your faith is that the world is terrible, that we're all sinners, that the sin is growing, that we should prepare for the end, even if you're in a close-knit family, in a highly organized church that goes out in the world and does things, if that's your message, you tend to be made unhappy by your own message, even though you're doing the things that normally correlate with happiness. And one of the ways we know this was an ingenious study done of the Westboro Baptist Church, everyone's least favorite church, in which they asked the members the normal "Are you happy?" questions, and they, unlike most activist churches, were very unhappy. And the scholars think that that was because of the substance of their message. What else you got?
Okay, thank you for answering that question. We've got another question here that I'm just going to read. It's a short one. Is there a difference between happiness and contentedness?
If happiness is an action, then we can never rest in it. But one of the things that wisdom brings is contentment. You're not as anxious because you have a broader view of what's happening in the world and what's likely to happen next and how your condition relates to other people's. So I think the state of contentment is one of the things that makes for happiness. At the end of this broadcast, we'll list some for further reading books. And the most fun one to read, the most useful one to read, is Gretchen Rubin's The Happiness Project. And she, a very smart woman, read this positive psychology stuff and decided to systematically apply it to her life. So month by month, she set goals, she kept charts, she saw what things she was doing that the research said should make her happier and what didn't. And at the end of the year, summed it all up. And what she concluded was that she was happier, but she was mostly happier for being grateful for what she had rather than for any new things that she started doing. And the biggest source of the increased happiness was stop doing the things that made her unhappy. One of the early findings in happiness research is that happiness and unhappiness are different emotions. They're measured differently. They both happen at the same time. The things that make you happy and the things that make you unhappy happen simultaneously. They're not a seesaw. And so you can be doing a lot of the things that make you happy. If you're also doing a lot of things that make you unhappy, particularly that make you anxious, then your net happiness is reduced. But if you just keep doing the same thing you've always done and reduce the anxiety, then that will increase your net happiness. What you got, Jamie?
I just want to say I haven't actually read Gretchen Rubin's book yet, but I signed up for her email list, and I check out her blog quite a bit, which is always rather interesting and very useful. And I think she's got some other books coming out, so she's an interesting individual. And you use that book in your course, right?
This is the core book in my course. I have thought it would make an excellent first-year reading book. It's the kind of book that students read out loud to their roommates and give as Christmas presents, and we do actions from it, random acts of kindness. I organize the students in little platoons to do good works together. All of this comes from this practical activity of applying positive psychology to make your own life better.
That's great. I've got another question here, and you kind of mentioned this about the news, and you know, there's so much terrible stuff happening right now. I'm not even going to name names because it just freaks me out. But so, you know, and a lot of what it seems to take to construct a happier society, it may need the help of the mass media. So this cultivation theory indicates that overexposure to news and media develops a mean world syndrome, I think is what it's called. Mm-hmm. So should we advocate for happier news, or should we just stop watching as much news?
I advocate a third way, which is watch the news critically. And the first part of the criticism of watching the news is you know it's a freak show. You know that's their job to present you bad news. And it's not their job to present a proportionate picture of the world. That you have to acquire on your own by reading the other stuff. And the other stuff especially is long-term trends, which is not very newsworthy, but is really the much bigger and more important picture of what's going on in the world. One of the most interesting books, and also in the further recommended reading, is Steven Pinker's The Better Angels of Our Nature, The Surprising Decline of Violence. And he looks at violence over the 500 years, over the 200 years since the Second World War and in the last generation. And in almost every measure, from assault to genocide, all of the measures of violence are down, well down. That this is a much more peaceful, less violent era than what went before, and that this seems so contrary to what we know from watching the news, because we report wars far away that once upon a time we wouldn't know anything about, and we report little wars without a sense of how tiny they are in terms of casualties compared to the big wars that happened even in the beginning of the 20th century. And that also applies domestically, that the murder rate is way down, the assault rate is way down, the rape rate is way down over historical norms. And that baseline, if you have that notion, then you can watch the news with greater equanimity, and you can see them as individual incidents against a trend rather than proof of a new trend.
Well, that's interesting too, because I just heard a report today about how the media, they'll release a story before they really have all of the details, and they'll say such and such thing has been reported, and then people just freak out over this supposed reporting, and then it just goes from there. So, you know, I think it's important what you said about critically watching the news. I mean, as for me, I just don't watch anymore. I only listen to it. And that seems to help a little bit.
As you know, most professors listen to NPR, which I tell students stands for National Professors Radio. That's not really true, but it's nearly true. It's culturally true. And one of the things they do is report the big bad things, but also report trends. And that's a very helpful way of having a sense of proportion.
Absolutely. We've actually got our first question from Twitter.
Yeah.
Does the definition of happiness change during each stage of your life, infancy through old age?
I think the basic idea of happiness is the same. We become wiser, if your life is unfolding well, in what it takes to achieve that same end that we have all along. So in the Nicomachean Ethics, he makes this claim at the beginning that happiness is the end of life and it's an action. And then he has all these middle chapters about how doing a practice requires a certain kind of excellence. And as you master that excellence, you become happier in achieving that particular kind of end. And I think that's true in the stages of life, that you master the excellence required in that stage of life, which prepares you for the next stage of life, and that all of those things together generally add up to more complex activities. They require greater investment, greater sacrifice, greater wisdom, and they can lead, if all goes well, to a life well lived. And when you get to the end of a life well lived and reflect back upon it, then you can see the virtue of each of those life stages led to the same end, even if it wasn't obvious at the time.
Okay, got another question that's come through on the YouTube feed, and it's a little long, so I'm going to post it for you to see it, Bo.
Okay.
See it?
Right. Yeah. Hello, Nora. That's a good question. Work is a surprisingly important part of our sense of worth. And I think this is not just from the Protestant work ethic, though the Protestant work ethic did harness that sense that work is a gift. It's a good thing. It's a knowledge that you're doing something meaningful in a way that had world-transforming effects, as Max Weber noted, and it is my duty as a sociologist to work Max Weber into every conversation, so there I did it. It is true, though, you can overwork. You can have an unbalanced life. And it actually goes back to the previous question, right, that seeking the good of one stage of life, of the working stage of life, at the expense of the other things, of your family relationships, first and foremost, of your service to your community, of volunteering, of working together with other people, and sheer stopping to smell the roses, leads to not doing your work excellently. Right? It, in fact, hinders the work that you're trying to do, you're trying to overdo, as well as hindering the other good parts of life. So balance, and Aristotle is Mr. Balance, would lead you to say in wisdom, you'll be better at your work if you do it in a balanced way with the other parts of life.
Bo, could you talk a little bit about the concept of lower pleasures versus higher pleasures?
Yeah. This is a debate especially that the utilitarians had. And Jeremy Bentham thought that everything was just pleasure and pain, and we didn't have to distinguish kinds of pleasure, that poetry is as good as pushpin, and therefore we could have a simple calculus of what made for happiness. And that would be the greatest good for the greatest number, which is measured by maximizing the net pleasure and minimizing net pains. But even another utilitarian, like John Stuart Mill, said that's just not so. There's higher and lower pleasures. And I think this is parallel to the question we asked earlier about life cycle, that you, as an adult, you appreciate the value of things that you didn't appreciate as a child. And that's higher and it was higher when you were a child too, but we make allowances for the fact that you weren't ready to appreciate that. Now, Aristotle, who was no Democrat, thought that the masses were like cows, right? The bovine masses are just mired in sense pleasure and don't even realize that there's greater kinds of pleasure to be had in the mastery of the skills of particular practices and in contemplation of the skills of a lifetime of service. He thought that people could be taught to appreciate those higher virtues. He never thought that most people would. Now, we in the education racket are more hopeful that everyone can be brought to appreciate higher pleasures to some degree, and that all of our students at Centre College, anyway, can be brought from the bovine masses of sense pleasure, which some of them wallow in their first term, to the higher understanding of service and contemplation, which we hope they have by the time they graduate. I'm now hoping that graduates will chime in and say, yes, that's exactly how it worked out.
Okay, so on the concept of lower pleasures, you know, there seem to be a lot of people in the world who seem perfectly satisfied practicing the lower pleasures. Would you argue that they aren't truly happy?
Because happiness is an action, it's also a journey. And so I am inclined to think that everyone is as happy as they can make themselves under the circumstances. But part of the circumstances is what they understand will make them happy. And there are always higher pleasures. There's always higher pleasures for everybody. There's the highest end of saints who cultivate virtue all the time, and you can be pretty confident that you're not that, right? You can be pretty confident that if you're listening to this conversation, you're not yet fully a saint. So there's more higher pleasures to appreciate. And that, I think, makes us humble in denigrating the mired in lower pleasures-ness of other people. And we should be helping one another achieve those things. And this is one of the things I think that voluntary associations for collective good can do, is show the virtue, show by life the virtue of higher pleasures, like the pleasure of service to others. And that will inspire some people to see that there's another way of living besides the one that they're doing right now. And I think we can all benefit from that, and it's a good social principle that we all should be seeking to find out what's the higher pleasure than the one we have so far mastered.
Okay, great. We've got another question that's come through on Twitter. Are there gender differences in what promotes happiness?
Now here Aristotle is no help. Aristotle was not good on women. He didn't really think they were fully human. So as we have come to read Aristotle through a modern lens, we assume that the things he's saying about men apply to everybody. And there isn't excellent research on this. Psychologists surprisingly don't spend as much time on gender as sociologists do. So the great body of happiness research focuses on the generic human being, typically a student in a Psych 110 course, without much differentiation of the kinds of pleasures that suit others. Now, I also teach a marriage and family class. I have been impressed with the continuing reality of sex differences in the population as a whole. It doesn't apply to every man and every woman, but we can make generalizations about men as a group, women as a group. And we see, especially in marriage and parenthood, that there are differences in how those roles collectively, normally, as a trend, work to make a happy unit. And so on that basis, I would say, yes, there are probably population differences in the things that make women happy, particularly mothers, and the things that make men happy. And that is an area ripe for further exploration.
Okay, we've had another question come through on the YouTube feed, and again, it's a rather large one, so I'm going to post it for you to read.
Mm-hmm. Right. Yeah. Okay. Good. This I'm glad you asked this question. This is one of the things that the economists have seized on. One of the things we find is if you ask people how happy are you now on, say, a 10-point scale, and what would make you higher? What would make you higher on the scale? What would make you happier? And they offer a bunch of things, a raise, a promotion, an honor. And then we see what happens to people who do get those things. And in general, what we find is they're happier for a while, and then they tend to revert back to the level of happiness they had before. The same is true for many things that would make them unhappy. And it is remarkable how resilient we are, how able we are to adapt both to bad things and to get used to good things. And this has led some psychologists and some economists to say that we have a set point, or at least a set range, and that people differ in how happy they can be. And this process of getting used to changes in happiness, high or low, the economists refer to as the hedonic treadmill. So that we keep working on this treadmill, and we go up and down, and we go down and up, and we end up at the same place. I think they exaggerate that, but it is probably true that there are personality differences in how happy someone is likely to feel. And even if they do the same kinds of things in life, they'll measure the scale a little differently. So some will report it as a 5, and some will report it as a 7 or an 8, the same kind of experience. That said, there are some things that do tend to change our long-term set point. A happy marriage is one of them, and particularly happy marriage coupled with parenthood does. And a few chronic bad things. Chronic illnesses, particularly painful ones, long-term unemployment, divorce, illnesses that recur unexpectedly, like multiple sclerosis, and commuting. Commuting seems to be one of those chronic conditions that makes us unhappy from the beginning to the end, and we never get used to it, which is a good reason to live closer to town. Those things do seem to change the set point, which then gives us some confidence that there's not an absolute fixed set point, even if we are born at a place that we're likely to stay. So I think it's certainly true that some people will always just be more cheerful and happier than others. But everyone can be happier than they are now, and that everyone can contribute to the happiness of others by their approach to happiness. That watching people do good things tends to make us happy. This is a phenomenon that the psychologist Jonathan Haidt, whose book The Happiness Hypothesis I have also put on that further reading, calls elevation. Right? Watching other people, watching Mother Teresa do her thing, tends to make people happy. Well, in the same way, watching people be unhappy, right, to complain, to see the worst in things, tends to bring us down. It's a social cost of bearing a community which has Eeyores in it and endlessly. And it is, of course, a good thing. It's a mitzvah to be helpful to other people who are down. But one of the ways that you can make life better is, even if you have a low relative set point of happiness, is to make the best of what you have, to be grateful for the things you have, rather than anxious for the ones you don't. And that not only makes you happier, but it makes the whole community that you're part of happier.
Okay, great. I've got another question. I can't post it right now, so I'm going to read it. Over the last generation, Americans, especially in the younger generations, have been gravitating away from the church. Aside from church and bowling leagues, what other organizations do you recommend they try to, form this sense of community and happiness?
Millennials, the current young adult generation, the people who we're still teaching at Center, the age of my own children, notably differ from the generations before in how much they want to do practical, hands-on good things. So we have had a real rise in service at Center compared to when the Gen Xers were here. They are suspicious of long-term commitments and large institutions. And that's partly a circumstance of their stage in life, right? That they'll see when they are running larger institutions, when they're trying to solve larger social problems, that you need organizations to do that. That simple hands-on work is insufficient. But the fact that they want to go help people directly and see an immediate impact is, I think, the same impulse that produces the voluntary associations that we've seen throughout American history harness that collective desire to make things better. And so if the previously existing institutions to do that, that could be churches, that could be the men's organizations like the Elks and the Kiwanis, the Masons, and so on, the women's organizations of every kind of social service organization, and homemakers and clubs in town, and civic women and the junior league. If those don't appeal to current generations, the impulse to do a good thing for others is still there. And I think it will produce new kinds of institutions which 2 generations hence will look as old-fashioned as the ones I just named do to the current generation. Because the impulse has to find a way out, and doing it by yourself is just not enough.
Interesting. Okay, another question from the YouTube feed. This is rather appropriate for the venue we're having this conversation in. Can you talk a bit about how the uptick in technology and social media has improved or hindered an individual's happiness?
Yeah. This is a controversial subject now. The research on the effects of social media is just in its infancy. Sociologists love this stuff. We have been studying social networks for way longer than we've had the tools to do it. And Facebook in particular has created a boom in social network studies. And one of the interesting things that we find is that moods, particularly sustained approaches to life, are contagious. So if most of the people in your network are happy, you are more likely to be happy. If most of the people in your network are unhappy, you're likely to be unhappy. And I think social media allows you to transmit those moods more widely. And so if you look at the whole of your friend group and the kinds of things that they put in their feeds, there's a tone to it. Facebook did a somewhat famous and notorious experiment last year in which they subtly altered the words in the feed that various of their customers got to see if that would then subsequently make them post happier words or less happy words themselves. And it did. Now, as far as actual human connection, this is the thing people often worry about in social media. Most people are friends with people on Facebook or in social media that they are also friends with, have some connection with in real life. And I think if that's a supplement to real life connections, which are reinforced repeatedly, then it's all a boon, it's all a help. Facebook has personally been great for me in keeping up with alumni, some of whom are writing in and watching right now, whose lives I wouldn't know about if we relied on, paper letters or even email, purpose written back and forth. But to be in that network of people who are generally concerned about similar things and post about their lives and their concerns reinforces that general body of concern. If, on the other hand, you have lots and lots of friends who you don't really know, they're not actually your friends, then I think that does conduce to falseness, artificiality, and that can be true in face-to-face life as well. And so one of the things that many young people learn is that after the initial burst of connecting with everyone they possibly could connect with, they have to weed their connections down to people they actually have ongoing relationships with. And that, I think, is a matter of maturity, both of individuals and of society as we digest and get used to these new modes of communication.
Very interesting. Another question from the YouTube stream. If people without sufficient money increase their money without the involvement of meaningful work or personal achievement, such as through stealing it or having it given to them through inheritance or government largesse, will the extra money still make them more happy?
There have been several interesting studies of lottery winners. And in general, I think many people know this now, they don't tend to see their lives greatly improved. That is to say, their happiness is not greatly improved because with the new money, which solves several problems, comes a host of other unwelcome social relations that people who build up to money gradually can work out slowly. Some people, of course, take a windfall and do good things with it, and others, of course, are capable of destroying themselves with that money at all. But the sheer money doesn't seem to create the new social relations that would conduce to happiness. Now, there was also in that question given to them by government largesse or stealing it, two quite different things. So stealing it, the core thing of Aristotle's claim about what makes us happy is meaningful work. And he doesn't regard stealing as meaningful work. I don't regard stealing as meaningful work. It is a kind of work, but it not only is not good, it's bad, produces bad, diminishes society, creates fear, it reduces trust. It diminishes the virtue of the people doing it. And so it's sort of a parody of what makes for a happy life. Right? You work together for a task with other people that's larger than yourself, but it's a bad task, and that's reductive. Now, as far as receiving gifts only can be diminishing. Right? We do want to maintain even relations with people. We want to give back to those who've given to us, which is one of the reasons that the social welfare is organized as a give and a take for everybody. Right? That we all pay taxes at some way or another, just when we buy things, that at periods of our lives when we are more producing, we pay more, and periods of our lives when we are more dependent, we receive, and that builds up the community as a whole to be a kind of community that is continuously concerned about the welfare of everybody. It is, of course, true that welfare dependency is possible, and this is as true with children who never get jobs and lounge around your house and failure to launch, as it is of the sometimes real and I think more imagined welfare cheats, and that it's a hard way to live. It is diminishing in several respects, including because it's poor and uncertain. But the sheer dependency, I think, is a problem, but not the main one. Right? Most people in welfare states give a lot, and they take some, and we all give and we all take. And I think to have a proportionate sense that we all participate in the giving and the taking binds us together rather than creates a division between people who are temporarily taking more and those are people who are temporarily giving more.
Okay, we've got another question from Twitter. What about exercise? Is an increase in endorphins a true increase in happiness?
The chemicals in our brains that that increase when we feel happy are the mechanism by which we have that feeling run through our body. And the ways that we achieve that matter. So Martin Seligman, one of the fathers of positive psychology, has written in his recent book, Flourish, that why drugs don't work, right? Why drugs that produce the mimic of those feelings of happiness by producing endorphins and so on, don't actually make us happier. And it's because the way we produce them matters in our lives, in our bodies, in our mastery of the virtues inherent in a practice that produced them in the first place. And so to take the shortcut of just taking a drug that produces the chemical signal of the happiness-inducing life ultimately undoes our bodies. We need more and more of that stimulus to get the same response, and diminishes our capacity to actually do the good things that would produce those things naturally, to produce those chemicals and those feelings naturally. Exercise is one of the ways. It is one of the practices of the body that the Greeks were very concerned about, interested in, saw the value of. And not just for the sake of the game being played or the exercise being undertaken, but also as a training and as a foundation for learning how to master other kinds of practices. We often rely upon sports as a model of how to master a practice, of how to be a team, of how to work together, of how to coach, of how to take coaching, which we then apply to harder and less end-focused activities. And so they're good in themselves, but they're mostly good as models for applying that kind of work to harder tasks. Or sort of a roundabout answer to that question.
You use a phrase on, I believe, on your blog called promoting confidence in the social system. What would that look like in action?
The first time I taught the Happy Society, I wanted it to be entirely positive. And I decided at the end of that first year that I had to explain the negative. And when I thought about it, the glue of a happy society is trust. And trust is a complex subject, and I'll come back to that. And the acid of a happy society is fear. And fear sometimes is based on real things, but very often is exaggerated. And indeed, there are some people in society who make a living out of exaggerating fear, out of scaring people into buying stuff, or to voting a certain way, or to gin up support for attacking others. And trusting the system is a way of building up not only the confidence that you have in the general order of society, but the capacity of those institutions to generate trust further, to be trustworthy. We'll go back to Putnam. Putnam, looking at Tocqueville, said that trust is a crucial measure of how society works, and that is one of the things that voluntary associations help create. And he thought we came to trust people by working together with them and seeing that they were trustworthy. A less famous political scientist named Eric Uslener, who mostly studies Congress, which right now is not a trustful institution, applied that kind of study to the general population as Putnam was looking at it. What Uslener concluded was, yes, there's some kind of trust that comes from working with people and getting to know that they are personally trustworthy. But the more important kind of social trust is what he called generalized trust or moralistic trust. People who trust others prior to experience, who are generally trusting of society. And particularly if you take that trusting, not trusting, and optimistic, pessimistic, and make a fourfold table of it, that cell of optimistic, generalized trusters are the crucial strategic minority in upbuilding society. Right? They're really the core leaders in making voluntary associations to do good in the world, who are likely to expect that other people will join them, who will carry on in the face of adversity, who will carry on in the face of rejections from some, and the sheer indifference of many. But ultimately, happy societies not only have more of those people, but foster them. And trusting in the goodness of the social order is one of the ways of fostering optimistic, generalized trusters. Was that an answer to the question? That seemed like sort of halfway to it.
I think it sounded great. So we're just about out of time, but I want to give you, Bo, just a couple of minutes to make some final comments. But before that, I want to remind everybody who's tuning in and watching that the broadcast will be available on the Center Alumni YouTube channel, and that we'll be posting follow-up information on Facebook and Twitter, so make sure to find us there. And I'd also like to let everybody know about our next Flameside chat. Will be 6 p.m. on Wednesday, November 5th. Be sure to tune in for a conversation with Drs. Dan Stroop, Benjamin Knoll, and Leah Rohr, and they'll talk about the outcomes of the general election, with particular attention to Kentucky's hotly contested Senate race. That should be a lot of fun. All right, Bo, any last comments for everybody watching?
Very good. One is, I am happy to continue this conversation. My email is bo.weston@center.edu. Just send me questions. I do write a blog, as Jamie mentioned, The Gruntled Center, gruntled being the opposite of disgruntled, and designed to spread contentment. And that pursuing the happy society is really the main subject matter of that blog. Happiness is a project that everyone is involved in. And so believing that you can achieve it and believing that your community is supportive of it is one of the things that is encouraging that to pursue that project personally. But also, I think it is helpful to know that reducing your anxiety that you can't achieve it actually helps you and other people. And that's a worthwhile thing you can do every day, right? You practice a random act of kindness for everybody, and it becomes habitual to you and spreads to them. And on that happy note, I will turn it over to Jamie.
Well, I don't know about everybody else, but I'm ready to go out there and be extra happy right now.
Yay.
Thanks a lot, Bo. Really appreciate you doing this with us and having a conversation. Always wonderful to hear your thoughts about life in general.
Very good.
So, everybody, thanks a lot. And come back November 5th. We'll see you then.
Very
Have a
good.
great night.
Good night.